For some country music stars, fame did not disappear slowly. It ended in a single night. One drunken performance, one devastating phone call, one terrible crash. And suddenly, the career they had spent decades building was never the same again. In this video, we revisit the fateful nights that changed country music legends forever. The moments when applause turned into silence, headlines destroyed reputations, and Nashville watched entire lives unravel before the sun came up. 1. George Glenn Jones. By the late 1970s, George Jones was already becoming one of the greatest voices country music had ever known. His performances were emotional, raw, and unforgettable. But behind the standing ovations and sold-out crowds, his life was quietly falling apart under the weight of alcohol and cocaine addiction. Friends, band members, and even promoters had begun to fear one particular thing: whether George would actually show up. Then came the night that changed everything. One evening, after another violent argument and another long stretch of heavy drinking, George disappeared before a scheduled performance. Fans waited, musicians stalled for time, backstage panic slowly turned into humiliation. By the end of the night, Nashville insiders were no longer whispering about his addictions. They were openly calling him unreliable. That was the beginning of the infamous nickname No-Show Jones. What made the moment so devastating was that George Jones was still at the peak of his talent. His voice remained extraordinary, but after that period, many venues hesitated to book him. Record executives grew nervous. Insurance costs climbed. Entire tours became unpredictable because nobody knew which version of George would arrive, the legend or the man destroying himself. The tragedy was not that one bad night ruined his voice. It was that one chaotic night permanently damaged the trust that held his career together. 2. Randy Bruce Trawick. For years, Randy Travis had been seen as one of the most respected men in country music. His deep voice, traditional sound, and calm public image helped revive classic country during the 1980s. To fans, Randy represented stability in a genre increasingly pulled toward pop success. But in the summer of 2012, one shocking night shattered that image forever. Police in Texas received reports of a naked man lying beside a wrecked car on a rural road late at night. When officers arrived, they discovered Randy Travis intoxicated, confused, and combative. According to reports, he allegedly threatened officers while being arrested. By sunrise, mugshots and headlines had spread across the country. The story exploded because nobody expected it from him. For decades, Randy had been viewed as the quiet gentleman of Nashville. Suddenly, television stations and tabloids were replaying footage of his arrest, while fans struggled to understand how one of country music's most respected figures had fallen so publicly. The humiliation became impossible to escape. Although Randy continued trying to repair his reputation afterward, the damage from that night never fully disappeared. Industry executives became cautious. Interviews became uncomfortable. His personal struggles became more famous than his music for a period of time. Then, only a year later, his devastating stroke changed his life forever. Looking back now, many fans see that infamous Texas night as the moment everything began collapsing. Not because it destroyed his talent, but because it exposed how fragile his private life had quietly become behind the image Nashville thought it knew. 3. Jackie Keith Whitley. By 1989, Keith Whitley was finally becoming the future of traditional country music. His voice carried heartbreak in a way few singers could imitate, and songs like When You Say Nothing at All had turned him into one of Nashville's fastest rising stars. Fans loved the sadness in his music. What they did not fully understand was how much of that pain was real. Behind the scenes, Keith had been battling alcoholism for years. Friends and fellow musicians often worried about the nights that spiraled out of control after concerts and recording sessions. Still, many believed he would eventually overcome it. He had a successful career, a loving marriage to fellow country star Lori Morgan, and the respect of nearly everyone in Nashville. Then came the final night. After spending an evening drinking heavily with friends at his home in Tennessee, Keith continued consuming alcohol long after everyone else had stopped. By the next morning, he was found dead from acute alcohol poisoning at just 33 years old. Nashville was stunned. The tragedy felt especially cruel because Keith was standing at the edge of superstardom. Many insiders believed he could have become one of the defining country artists of the 1990s. Instead, one devastating night froze his story forever in unfinished form. What makes Keith Whitley's story so haunting is that nothing dramatic happened publicly. There was no scandal, no violent crash, no screaming headlines during the night itself, just silence. And by sunrise, country music had lost one of the greatest voices it would ever hear. For Donald Eugene Lytle, before the world knew him as Johnny Paycheck, Donald Eugene Lytle had already built a reputation as one of country music's wildest outlaws. His voice was rough, rebellious, and perfect for songs about anger, drinking, and hard living. By the late 1970s, hits like Take This Job and Shove It had made him a working-class hero across America. But one violent night in 1985 changed his career forever. That evening began like many others around Johnny Paycheck: alcohol, tension, and unpredictable behavior. While at a bar in Ohio, an argument suddenly escalated between Paycheck and another man. Witnesses later described a chaotic confrontation that quickly spiraled out of control. Then came the moment nobody could take back. Johnny pulled out a handgun and fired. The victim survived, but the damage to Paycheck's career was immediate and devastating. The story spread across the country within hours. Radio stations hesitated, promoters backed away. Fans who once celebrated his outlaw image suddenly saw something darker and more dangerous behind it. Soon afterward, Johnny Paycheck was convicted and sent to prison. For many country stars, controversy increased popularity. But this was different. That single night transformed him from a rebellious country legend into a cautionary tale about self-destruction and uncontrolled rage. Even after his release from prison years later, the shadow of that shooting never disappeared. The tragedy was that Johnny Paycheck had always sold the image of a dangerous outlaw. But on that night, the line between performance and reality finally disappeared forever. 5. Melinda Gail McCready. In the mid-1990s, Mindy McCready seemed destined to become one of country music's brightest new stars. Her debut album produced massive hits, her voice carried both vulnerability and power, and Nashville believed she could dominate country radio for years. But behind the fame, Mindy's personal life was becoming increasingly chaotic in ways few fans fully understood. Then came the night that changed everything. In 2004, after years of emotional struggles, unstable relationships, and growing substance abuse problems, Mindy was arrested following a late-night incident involving forged prescriptions and erratic behavior. By morning, tabloids and entertainment shows were no longer discussing her music. Instead, they focused entirely on her breakdown. That night became the beginning of a public collapse that never truly stopped. For female country artists especially, Nashville often judged personal scandals more harshly than talent itself. Mindy's reputation quickly shifted from rising star to troubled celebrity. Record labels grew distant. Industry executives hesitated to invest in her comeback attempts. Interviews became painful to watch as fans realized how deeply she was struggling. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was that her voice never disappeared. Even during her darkest years, many people still believed she possessed one of the purest talents of her generation. But after that infamous night, every appearance seemed overshadowed by concern, gossip, and sadness instead of music. Mindy McCready's story was not destroyed by one failed song or one bad album. It was slowly consumed after one painful night exposed how fragile her life had quietly become beneath the spotlight. 6. Hiram King Williams. By the early 1950s, Hank Williams had already become the soul of country music. His songs sounded painfully honest, as if every lyric came directly from a broken heart somewhere deep inside him. Audiences adored him because he sang about loneliness, regret, and suffering better than anyone else. What most fans did not realize was that Hank was living those emotions every single night. Years of alcohol abuse, painkiller addiction, and physical agony from chronic back problems had pushed him dangerously close to collapse. Promoters increasingly worried about his condition before concerts, but Hank kept performing through exhaustion and pain because country music could not imagine itself without him. Then came the final night. On New Year's Eve, in 1952, Hank climbed into the backseat of a Cadillac headed toward another performance. He was sick, heavily medicated, and barely functioning, but the tour continued anyway. Somewhere during the overnight drive through freezing weather, Hank Williams quietly died in the car at only 29 years old. By the time the vehicle reached its destination, country music had already changed forever. The shock was enormous because Hank was not fading away professionally. He was still one of the biggest stars in America. But after that night, his unfinished life became part of his legend. Fans no longer saw only the singer of heartbreak songs. They saw a haunted young man destroyed by pressure, addiction, loneliness, and relentless touring. That lonely car ride became one of the most tragic nights in music history, not because it ended a declining career, but because it ended a legendary one that still felt unstoppable. 7. David Allan Coe. For decades, David Allan Coe built his reputation as one of country music's most controversial outlaws. He embraced danger, rebellion, and chaos more openly than almost anyone else in Nashville. Fans loved him because he seemed unpredictable, like a man who could walk onto a stage at any moment and either deliver brilliance or disaster. Then one night proved both were possible. During a concert in the 1990s, tensions backstage reportedly exploded after a series of arguments involving alcohol, exhaustion, and frustration with the industry. As the night spiraled further out of control, David Allan Coe allegedly lashed out violently during the confrontation. Stories from that evening spread quickly through Nashville circles, reinforcing the growing belief that Coe's personal chaos was beginning to overshadow his music itself. The incident became another major turning point in a career already surrounded by controversy. For years, David had survived scandals because audiences still viewed him as authentic. But after that night, many promoters and industry figures saw him as increasingly difficult to manage. Opportunities slowly became smaller. Mainstream country radio moved further away from him. Younger audiences began knowing the controversies before they knew the songs. What made the situation especially tragic was that David Allan Coe remained a gifted songwriter respected by countless musicians behind the scenes. Even artists who avoided his public image often admired the honesty and emotional depth in his music. But one destructive night strengthened the idea that his self-created outlaw identity had finally become larger than his talent. And once that happens in country music, rebuilding trust becomes almost impossible. 8. Tanya Denise Tucker. When Tanya Tucker became a star as a teenager, country music saw her as fearless, rebellious, and wildly talented. Her voice carried maturity far beyond her age, and by the late 1970s, she was already one of Nashville's biggest female artists. But fame arrived so early and so intensely that chaos eventually followed her everywhere. Then came one disastrous night in the early 1980s that changed how the industry viewed her forever. After an evening of heavy partying tied to her turbulent relationship with rock star Glenn Campbell, stories began spreading through tabloids and entertainment television about drunken fights, public screaming matches, and reckless behavior behind closed doors. By morning, the focus was no longer Tanya Tucker's music. It was her personal life. That shift became devastating. Nashville in that era often forgave troubled men far more easily than troubled women. While male outlaws were celebrated, Tanya suddenly became labeled unstable and self-destructive. Industry executives began treating her less like a respected artist and more like a scandal waiting to happen. Her career momentum slowed as tabloids increasingly followed her every move. What made the moment so painful was that Tanya's talent had not disappeared at all. Her voice remained powerful, emotional, and unmistakable. But after that infamous night, every new song seemed buried beneath gossip about drinking, relationships, and emotional chaos. Years later, Tanya Tucker would fight her way back and rebuild her legacy. But many fans still look at those explosive nights in the early 1980s as the moment her career stopped being defined purely by music and became defined by survival instead. 9. Billy Joe Shaver. Among hardcore country music fans, Billy Joe Shaver was considered a legend long before mainstream audiences fully understood his influence. He wrote songs filled with pain, faith, violence, redemption, and survival. Artists across Nashville respected him deeply because Billy Joe Shaver did not sound manufactured. He sounded real. But one violent night in 2007 changed the public conversation around him forever. While attending a bar in Texas, Billy Joe became involved in a heated confrontation with another man. Witnesses later described rising tension, threats, and a situation that escalated rapidly outside the building. Then, during the chaos, Billy Joe Shaver pulled out a firearm and shot the man in the face. Amazingly, the victim survived. The story exploded across the country because it sounded less like a country music headline and more like something from one of Billy Joe's own outlaw songs. Suddenly, news stations and newspapers were discussing attempted murder allegations instead of his songwriting legacy. The case dragged his name into national controversy and permanently altered how many people viewed him. For longtime fans, the incident felt tragic because Billy Joe had always written honestly about violence, struggle, and human weakness. But after that night, the line between the storyteller and the man himself became deeply uncomfortable. Although Billy Joe Shaver continued performing afterward and was ultimately acquitted, the shadow of that shooting never completely faded. Many younger fans first discovered his name through the controversy rather than the music that had inspired generations of country artists. One violent night did not erase his talent, but it forever changed the way the world remembered it. 10. Christina Claire Simonella. By the 1980s, Winona Judd and her mother Naomi had become one of the most beloved duos in country music history. The Judds represented warmth, family, faith, and emotional honesty. Their harmonies felt deeply personal to millions of fans across America. On stage, they looked inseparable. Then came the night that changed everything forever. In 1991, just as the Judds stood at the peak of country music success, Naomi Judd privately revealed devastating news to her daughter. She had been diagnosed with hepatitis C and could no longer continue touring. The conversation shattered Winona emotionally. Overnight, the career she had built alongside her mother suddenly faced collapse. Only hours later, plans were already forming for what would become the Judds' farewell tour. For fans, the announcement felt heartbreaking and surreal. One of country music's most successful acts disappeared almost instantly, not because of declining popularity, but because life had suddenly intervened in the cruelest possible way. Winona was forced to step into a solo career while carrying enormous emotional pressure and fear for her mother's health. What made that night so painful was that nothing publicly dramatic happened. No scandal exploded, no arrest occurred, no violent tragedy filled headlines by morning. Instead, it was a quiet private conversation between mother and daughter that permanently changed the future of both women. Winona would eventually become a major solo star in her own right, but many fans still view that night as the moment innocence disappeared from her life forever. Because after that conversation, country music no longer saw the Judds. It only saw what remained afterward.